Thank you for joining us for the Lifelong Learning at Home series presented by the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning. For over 20 years, the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning has been offering unique adult learning opportunities on Laurier's Waterloo and Brantford campuses. Our non-credit courses are intended for personal interest and self-education. Even though we're working from home and maintaining physical distance, we want to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University is located on the Haldeman Tract, traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. In doing this land acknowledgement, we recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and water on which Laurier is now present. We do a land acknowledgement as a small act towards reconciliation and to give us all a moment to reflect on and honor the land and Indigenous presence on this land. We're pleased to offer you this opportunity to learn from your own home and are excited to be joined today by Michael Emort and Jennifer Marshman. Michael Emort received his PhD from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Michael is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. His research interests include environmental ethics and the many ways in which representations of landscape are used and abused for political purposes. Jennifer Marshman is a PhD candidate in Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University with the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems. Jennifer is a human geographer and food systems researcher whose past research in Canada and in China has explored community food security, urban agriculture, and the lived experiences of street food vendors. Thank you for joining us today, Michael and Jennifer. We will now turn it over to you for your lecture, How Can Geography Help Us Understand the COVID-19 Pandemic?
All right, thank you very much, Lindsay. Gives me great pleasure to be here and speak, however remotely, to an audience of people interested in what geography has to say about COVID-19, this totally new situation that has thrown all of us for a loop, including university teachers like myself who have to come up with a completely new way of teaching. And you are experiencing this new way right now, online or remote lectures with all the drawbacks and all the advantages. So let us jump in then. So today, my colleague Jennifer Marshman and I would like to talk with you, to you, about how can geography, our subdiscipline, help us understand what has been going on with this COVID-19 pandemic. So this lecture, we divided into 4 little lecturettes of about 10 to 15 minutes each, and they will deal with, first of all, what created the conditions for this emergence of SARS-CoV, this pandemic. I will begin that, and then Jennifer will take it over and talk about the various ways in which we can map and interpret these maps about the goings-on with this disease. Pardon me. How can we make sense of the numbers and the distributions that we see every day in the news? And then I come back and I talk a very little bit, it's going to be a shorter lecturette, about specific geographical concepts, things that we geographers use in our daily analysis to understand what is going on. And then lastly, Jennifer will wrap it up for us with a very personal introduction to how you can better protect yourself. So with her background as a very experienced nurse in public health, she will tell you how to better put on your mask, take it off, and do all those things that help you, as well as larger control measures, population health control measures. All right, so let's jump in. If you're of my generation, then you're still familiar with this test screen from the TV age. So here we are, we thought we put this up as our little dividers. So the first lecturette that I am going to give is about what created the conditions for the emergence of the pandemic. What do geographers have to say about that? Geographers look at everything through spatial interaction. It simply means, how do things, people, ideas, money even, interact across space? There are lots of theories and laws that geographers have contributed to this discussion, to this examination, and I'll share some of those with you a little bit later. So some of the geographical concepts you are familiar with, such as space or location or distance, although of course we geographers use them in much more complicated ways. But what we want to talk about a little bit more today, and specifically is the highlighted terms here: proximity, diffusion, connectivity, accessibility. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go into too much gory detail here, but I'm just going to show you how we use those terms, those concepts as geographers to pick apart how a disease emerges, spreads, and can be contained. So I'm going to throw this big sentence at you right away. Proximity increases the opportunities for spillover events of zoonotic diseases. That's basically the message of this first lecturette, and I'm going to take it apart together with you. First one, proximity simply means nearness, nearness of things, people, anything to each other. So essentially, the nearer things or people are, the greater the opportunities for spillover events. Zoonotic diseases are those diseases, very simply, that originate with animals, but can jump to humans under the right conditions. And we're going to look at those conditions in this first lecturette. What enables a disease to jump over? And then lastly, that jumping over is called a spillover event, when a pathogen leaps, if you will, from one pool of organisms, hosts, to another. So what happens when someone gets sick, whether it be a person or an animal? We have a pathogen, something that makes us sick, and we have a host, something that is made sick by this germ, bacteria, virus, whatever we may have. And often those two meet directly, and the pathogen infects the host, and the disease begins to manifest itself in whatever way it is. Often, however, we have a in-between participant here that's called a vector, some other form of organism that enables the pathogen to more simply or more easily infect the host organism. So the pathogen can directly infect the host or can go through a vector organism, a carrier, if you will, a vehicle for the infection. So in our case here, the pathogen is the coronavirus. Very obviously, the vector in the COVID case or the coronavirus case is presumed to be bats. Other candidates for this unsavory distinction have been civet cats or pangolins, animals that are either native to China or are imported to China for purposes of traditional Chinese medicine or eating. And so the pathogen infects the vector, the bat, who is not itself falling ill from this, but can carry that disease further and give it then to the host, in this case, a new host population, namely that of humans. So we got infected, not directly by the coronavirus, by touching the virus or anything, but we are infected through a vector organism, presumably bats. So you've seen those three circles overlap, and that is the interesting area that we want to look at a little bit more closely. That is the intersection of where all of these three come together, the pathogen, the vector, and the new host, humans. And two candidates for this distinction have been mentioned. One is a lab. It could be a lab in which scientists monkeyed around with disease-causing organisms, and they might have been accidentally released those pathogens, or some people even say intentionally, but that is not what we're going to talk about here today. We're going to talk about the first candidate or the first opportunity for spillover, and that is a so-called wet market. And I'm going to talk to you about the increased opportunities for spillover events represented by the conditions at such a wet market. Before we do that, though, I want to just spend 1 minute on the word wet market and the image that that produces. By now, when you type wet market into Wikipedia, you get a picture like this, a gory, for our Western standards, a gory depiction of an open butcher shop, blood on the floor, people in flip-flops handling the foodstuffs. So it immediately creates a very negative idea of a wet market. But when we really think about it, the original meaning of a wet market is a market that sells fresh foodstuffs. That could be turnips, or it could be chickens, or it could be anything that's edible. And in that sense, the St. Jacob's Farmers Market is a wet market. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, what makes the situation a little bit more critical in China, where we think the virus jumped over, is that there is also wildlife being traded. And that wildlife mixes up the situation a little bit and adds some other risk factors. So wildlife markets, according to my slide definition there, are mostly illegal places because most countries have banned wildlife markets. because of international conventions or of health regulations. But they continue to exist in large numbers illegally. And often these wildlife markets are conducted under the cover of a wet market because it offers good opportunities to hide your wares amongst all the other goods. And so you can launder, if you will, illegal wildlife parts or animals. So Jennifer has provided me with a couple of pictures of wet markets in China. So they look like any other vegetable market in any other country. So we need to keep in mind wet markets are not necessarily gory, awful places. They can be just normal marketplaces where the majority of the population could get their daily food supplies from vendors.
Jump in for a second here.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you showed that first image, because it's a really good reminder that sometimes in the media we're seeing images that were selected, they were chosen because they evoke some kind of reaction when people see them. And oftentimes the reality of this situation is much more sort of normal than that. It's much more, what we would standardly think of a market looking like here, for example. So I'm really glad that you showed that image to start off.
Yeah, and thank you for providing those images. The next couple of images come from Jennifer too. So here's another example. And yes, you could say, do I approve of foodstuffs being displayed right over the gutter? That raises some sanitary ideas, but that could happen in any other setting. And it's not necessarily a characteristic of the wet market or the wet market in China. Here's another image that Jennifer provided. So here the poor frogs are being prepared for their final performance in the soup bowl, right next to where pedestrians walk, right next to the gutters. So yeah, there are challenges with sanitary conditions, but they have been like this for many centuries. So why do we get emergence of diseases now? Well, later on you'll hear that the emergence of diseases is nothing new. They always have happened, but we have created conditions that are more conducive to such emergences to happen in higher frequencies. So when we have a wildlife market going on under the cover of a wet market, we have what I call the perfect storm for a spillover event. And I give you a number of reasons there. First of all, because that situation brings together organisms that normally don't meet each other, so they don't have any exposure, and that means they have no resilience to each other's diseases, for example. They just haven't encountered diseases before, and then a new situation brings new risks with it. Secondly, the animals are clearly stressed, which means their immune system is compromised, which means they express a disease more readily and also are more infectious, probably. Giving off that disease to other uninfected organisms. Then all of this is happening under usually crowded circumstances. And here's where the word proximity comes in. Simply by squeezing everyone into a smaller area in this market situation, we increase the risk of infection. And then finally, as I mentioned a couple of times, unsanitary conditions can do their own contribution to this increase of the risk. Just to illustrate that, I give you here a quote from the Canadian Geographic from 2 months ago, where Carrie Bowman, the author, went to the market that presumably is the source of this outbreak. And she says there, wet market, yeah, but 2/3 of the species there were wildlife, and they were clearly cramped or kept cramped in unclean conditions, and they were stressed and weak. So all the things that I just gave you there in the bullet point here, they're nicely exemplified in the report about her visit. So the question then is, why do we allow these conditions to go on or even to worsen over time? Well, there are several drivers behind that. And the very first one, very openly, is hunger. People rely on wildlife often in many countries to satisfy their food requirements, their protein requirements. So this is an example from Ghana, where we have, partially dismembered animals being offered for sale. And if you look a little bit to the left in the back, that little pen has live animals in it. So we have the mixing of live, butchered animals, and again, that is one of the main conditions for transmission. Also, markets are used to promote and sell illegal animal parts, wildlife parts that are held to have certain medicinal characteristics. Traditionally, particularly in traditional Chinese medicine, TCM. So here, for example, a picture from a wildlife market where you can buy all kinds of animal parts that are worth a lot of money in China, for example. So that would be driver number 2, demand for those wildlife body parts because they're believed to have medicinal functions. Here is a picture taken of pangolins. So that is the animal I mentioned earlier as a possible candidate for spilling or for being a vector for COVID. Pangolins, the most widely trafficked and hunted wildlife on this planet. It's not elephants, it's not rhinoceros, it's the pangolin, that cute little animal with all the scales. The scales, made from the same material as our fingernails, are thought to have great characteristics and are highly prized in China. Third reason, some people insist on having exotic pets. Do I need to say anything more than Justin Bieber? Right? Remember a few years ago with his monkey, his pet monkey, and then when the monkey wasn't convenient at some airport security check, he abandoned the pet there. So there are some questionable behaviors with regard to exotic pet trades. And so here you see the trader being very mindful that his offerings are not being photographed. I think those are monkeys in the cage. And again, they're right next to dead animals down there in the left crate, close to the floor, to the ground. Pardon me. And so lastly here, this is an animal that's still alive, that's being displayed by the trader in Indonesia, in this case, a fruit bat, I believe. And so you can see that the animal is resisting, and it could probably scratch the handler, it can bite the handler, and presto, we have an opportunity for the transmission of a disease carrying bodily fluid. And boom, there we have your opportunity for a spillover from animals to humans. So obviously, wet wildlife markets are that hotspot where this frequency of interspecies contact is shooting high, and we have a higher risk of transmission. And that is not just a theory. Look at the bullet list down there. The avian flu, the SARS epidemic, and the recent COVID or current COVID pandemic, they all emerged under such conditions. So those are the ones that we definitely know of, but there might have been more that we don't know, or I don't know of at this point. So wildlife markets are something then we should probably be in principle and in practice be very opposed to. We should prevent them from happening. But there are other bigger reasons that we should take into consideration as well, okay? First of all, most of the diseases that come to us from animals. So 75% of the new infectious diseases come to us from the animal kingdom, from our cousins in the animal kingdom. And here's a list of all of those that have, in the last few decades, jumped over to human populations. It's quite a list, isn't it? Yeah. You're familiar with all of the acronyms, I believe. MERS is the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome that jumped from camels to people. And we're keeping a very, very close eye on this. The World Health Organization thinks that there are 30 major situations of major concern involving zoonotic diseases that could spill over into human populations in the near future. So COVID is not a unique case. It is one of several. Now, having said all of this, I don't want to paint wildlife trade as the only responsible or the only negative situation here. What we do to farm animals is equally dangerous for ethical reasons. We're not talking about that here. We're not talking about calorie provision, but dangerously in a, pardon me, in a disease prevention context. We keep our farm animals, pigs, cows, under such atrocious conditions, crammed together so much that we need to feed them constantly antibiotics so they are resilient towards all kinds of bacterial infections. 80% of all the antibiotics on this planet ends up in farm animals, and then we eat them, of course, right? So Just a little side note, this is not all about wildlife. We should also look very closely at what we produce in disease-generating circumstances in our farms. Okay, so moving yet another step outward, if you wish, there are other very, very big picture mechanisms at work here that we need to acknowledge. So we'll start with the left square, the highlighted aspects there. Anytime we destroy or change habitat, we contribute to a squeezing of the remaining wildlife habitat, meaning that the animals are exposed to new risks, that they are cramped more, that they have a worse nutrition situation because they can't find enough food. So all of these reasons, their land use change from forest to field, for example, for production of food or biofuel that we put into our cars. Urban sprawl, anytime we do any of those activities, those changes, we make the situation worse for the remaining wildlife, and they become more, if you will, infectious to us because we're simply pushed together more closely. There's the word again, proximity. And then the last point here, climate change, bring that into the equation as a threat multiplier, because what we do on an everyday basis, changing the climate on this planet, changing vegetation belts and habitats and whatnot, leads to that squeezing of wildlife habitats as well. Let's move to the next square, reduce biodiversity. Every time we remove animals from the food web, from the ecological web, be it through the use of pesticides that kill bees, for example. Look at the chart behind Jennifer, and she's the bee woman, so she knows all about that. Every time we selectively breed animal populations to make them more resilient or more competitive, every time we hunt certain species out of the wildlife spectrum, remove them, all of that has the effect that more resilient species begin to dominate. And why are they more resilient? Because they have a higher immunity to diseases, for example, which means they are much more effective vectors to take that disease to us eventually, right? So let's move to the third one. Oh, no, pardon me, before I do that, let's look at that little blue arrow there in the red circle. Those two, of course, those two boxes show you factors that can act independently, but of course, every time you destroy habitat, you also reduce biodiversity. So there's even interaction between those mechanisms, which we need to take into consideration. And then next we have wildlife trade, you know, what I began to talk about. If we transfer species to new areas, we definitely change the setup of the ecological web there. Often invasive non-native species are invasive because they are more competitive, because they have advantages over the native species. And that all upsets the balance. So all of this combined with proximity, the increase of contacts leads to a heightened risk situation. And that is exactly what has hit us here with the COVID emergence. All of those factors have come together and produced a situation where the disease could jump over to humans. So here's a list. I'm not going to go through this. You can read through this yourself when you review this video. There are well-established examples how the squeezing of habitats and the changing of the life situation of wildlife has led, or at least contributed to, the emergence of diseases that originated in the animal kingdom and then moved to us, including Lyme, which yours truly is one of the unfortunate sufferers. I got caught by that one. So let's return to this diagram, because there's a little bit more in this even, and I'm going to come to the end of my first lecture right here, wrapping it up for you. So these mechanisms don't just happen out of the blue. They have reasons why they occur, right? And those reasons are very simply our lifestyle. We want all kinds of things. We want tropical fruits out of season, or I should say every season. We want all kinds of imports. We want cheap goods. We want this, that, and the next thing. And to do that, we have to appropriate the earth and use it to produce for us. And that is the main factor of all of those processes that we looked at in those three boxes there, right? So the human appropriation of earth, to use the earth and its resources for our needs and wants, is driving all of that. And all of this has greatly accelerated after 1945 with the emergence of the post-war economic system. look at the list here: population growth, mobility, economic activity, resource consumption. All of that has, of course, multiplied and continues to multiply. Even as we live through the ecological era, all of those are going up. So we're making the situation worse on a daily basis rather than better, right? So all of those factors work together to force more and more wildlife to live much closer to us than they would like to. And that is good for us because we pick up diseases from them. That's not something new. I really want to make sure that we know that this is not something that all of a sudden hit us. No, it has always happened. Anytime after the decision of humans to settle down and stay in one place and to domesticate animals and bring them into our villages, if you will, we have had these events of spillovers. Just look at that list there. Measles and tuberculosis from our friends, the cows, or influenza from ducks, who would have thought, right? So we pick up a lot of diseases from our animal cousins, and this is only continuing to increase in frequency and probably severity because we're also taking a lot of resilience out of the ecosystem with our behaviors that I just described here. So, having taken it to this bleak point where I gave you a lot of bad news, I'm sorry, I will pass it over to Jennifer, who will talk about how you and I can understand and prepare better. Okay, over to you, Jennifer.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, Michael. And also thank you, Lindsay, for the introductions back a while ago there. So hi, everyone. So Michael has now introduced us to some important geographical concepts and talked about the origins of COVID-19 and that perfect storm that created the conditions for it to not only infect a new human host, but also some of the factors that aided in the spread. And he'll be talking more about that in the next lecturette. So now that we have that background, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how that translates into some relevant information for us here in Waterloo Region. So some of what I talk about may be review for some of you, but we thought it would be a good idea to have all of this information in one place. Okay, so one of the things that many of us want to know is what is our risk of being infected and what happens if we are infected with and we develop COVID-19. So this pandemic is very dynamic. The numbers are changing daily and we're learning more all the time and piecing together all of this data as we go. We know that there's issues with tracking and testing, and we have to keep in mind that all of the information we have about who's getting sick is based on things like testing capacity and also the lag time between being tested and when we get results. It's not necessarily on those real-time numbers of people who are infected. Another issue is that most often we're seeing counts, total numbers of cases per country or region, instead of seeing cases as a percentage of the population, which would be more meaningful because that gives us a better ability to compare rates and to put those numbers into some sort of context. So just to illustrate this, this is a count or a total number of reported cases for 5 countries. So you'll notice that each interval on the vertical axis increases by a factor of 10. So each interval looks equal here while we're looking at it, but actually the difference in numbers between Canada at under 100,000 and the United States at over 1 million cases is much more significant than this visually represents. It's hard to see when the information is displayed like this. So this number also tells us nothing about the risks of contracting the illness because we don't know what our denominator is or how many people are in that population. So just to unpack that a little bit, if 1 million people test positive in a population of 1 million people, then we would have an infection rate of 100%. But if everyone tested in a population of 100 million people and then 1 million people tested positive, that would only be a rate of 1% of the population. So that paints a completely different picture than simply saying there were 1 million positive tests. So this is why it's important to put these numbers into some sort of context so that we know exactly what we're talking about. So here's what that data looks like for those 5 countries if we show number of reported cases per 1,000 people. So now the data becomes more comparable. So this data is 2 weeks old now, but the comparison has stayed roughly the same. So on June 2nd, per 1,000 people, China had reported less than 0.01 cases. And if we contrast that with Canada, we had reported almost 2.5 positive tests per 1,000 people. And the United States had more than double that with 5.3 positive tests per 1,000 people. So also important just to mention here that reported cases are not homogeneously distributed. So in other words, the density of those cases is not uniform across any one of these geographical areas. So for example, we know in China, reported cases were concentrated in Wuhan, which is the capital city of Hubei province. In our Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, our geospatial specialist, Trina King, introduced me to this series of maps. These are by a cartographer named Kenneth Field, and they illustrate that the choices we make when we create maps can lead to very poor interpretations of information, and data can be displayed in ways that are really misleading, that really mislead us. So this map is called a choropleth map. This particular map leaves a very strong impression. This was one of the most common kinds of maps that was being circulated early on in the pandemic, and it uses color to show statistical variables. The choice of how numbers are categorized and the choices of colors that are used, these are really important. So the way that the information is presented on this map, including that choice of sort of this red danger color, makes it appear as though nearly half of China is infected with the coronavirus. It also makes it appear as though there are 5 provinces, so those are the ones in that darkest red color, that deep burgundy color, with similarly high numbers, including Hubei province. But if we look at this bar chart of cases by province, we can see that Hubei province really was an outlier, and really a dramatic outlier when we look at it this way. So we can change the choropleth map to better reflect this by categorizing the cases over a denominator of 100,000 people. So this is a more appropriate number given the size of the population. And when we do that, we get a map that looks like this. So not only is the color choice less aggressive, so it's sort of less screamy, but it also better reflects the distribution of cases just by choosing a more appropriate way to divide and display those categories. So we can now see a more accurate representation of the distribution of cases in China, with Hubei province in the dark blue color being by far the most impacted. So if we look at these 2 maps side by side, you can really see how the same information can be displayed quite differently. And just to be cognizant of that when you see these types of maps being reported on, just in the same way we were thinking about media imagery and how sometimes the images are used to evoke a reaction. Okay, so on average in Canada, we're still testing roughly 1 person per 1,000 people every day. So our testing numbers are still low, but as long as we stay below 10% of all tests being positive, we can be fairly confident that our surveillance is sensitive and catching the right people. So we do have a bit of a better idea about the number of the sickest people, since these are the people that are likely to be receiving care and therefore being tested. But we can't extrapolate those numbers to a mortality rate because we don't know the total number of people infected. We can estimate rates. Our surveillance, as I said, our surveillance appears to be quite sensitive, with only about 5% of all tests coming back positive. So just to build on what Michael was talking about with that perfect storm, I want to look at some risk factors which can increase a person's susceptibility to illness. So we don't fully understand all the ways that compounding factors influence immunity, or why some people are getting really sick with this and others aren't. But we do know that there are certain factors that influence our susceptibility. So we know that things like age, pre-existing conditions like diabetes and heart disease especially, and comorbidities or multimorbidities increase susceptibility to poor outcomes. That term comorbidities, that's simply just talking about when there's more than one disease or condition present in the same person at the same time. So all of these things can create additional stress on our ability to effectively fight an illness, heal and stay healthy, not just with COVID-19, but with all illnesses. So there's other factors such as access to poor sanitation, poverty, gender, and other factors that we won't be getting into in today's lecture, but that are also important considerations when we're talking about risk factors. So this graph shows us that, as most of us are aware, children and young adults are far less likely to experience the worst outcomes when they're infected with this virus. So that doesn't mean that they can't suffer poor outcomes. Unfortunately, we have seen that younger people have died from this illness. Another thing to remember is that younger people, they may be less likely to die from COVID-19, but they can still get sick enough to require hospitalization, which is putting additional strain on the healthcare system. So this graph shows us that the most positive tests are in the 80+ age group. This could be a result of increased testing in long-term care homes. This has changed a little bit over the past month or so, where that age group is now testing the most positive results. But we can see here that people ages 40 to 60 have the next highest positive testing rate, and that people ages 20 to 40 have more positive tests than people ages 60 to 80. But this next graph from Public Health, the Public Health Agency of Canada, shows us that the worst outcomes by age group, so this is people who have tested positive and have been admitted to the hospital, to ICU, or have died. We can see here that the worst outcomes happen in those over the age of 80. So this middle orange bar shows ICU admissions, and the green bar on the right-hand side of each category shows us deaths. So you'll notice that ICU admissions in the 80+ age group are much lower than the younger age groups, even though this is the age group with the highest mortality rate. So this is due to several factors. One would be that this age group is more likely to have advanced directives that prevent the kinds of life-saving measures that happen in the ICU, so they wouldn't necessarily be admitted there. This is also the age group most often living in long-term care facilities, and because of either advanced directives or possibly because of swift decline in status, this population may pass away in the long-term care facility rather than in a hospital setting. So in long-term care facilities, we're seeing a trend of outbreaks and deaths from COVID-19. In Canada, about 80% of the deaths are happening in the long-term care population. So along with being more likely to have those pre-existing conditions or those comorbidities, there's other social and environmental factors which make this a higher risk population that I think are really important to sort of briefly touch on. So especially early on in the pandemic, many of the long-term care staff were working multiple part-time positions in multiple long-term care homes, making transmission between facilities more likely. And then long-term care homes, they might be severely understaffed. And even when they have a full complement of care providers, the caregiver to resident ratio can be very low, with each caregiver looking after many residents. So this increases the likelihood of repeated contact between residents through care providers as they move from resident to resident providing care. This becomes a high risk scenario when we have pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic people that have that prolonged contact with susceptible individuals, especially in the absence of personal protective equipment like gowns, gloves, masks, and eye protection. So unregulated care providers. These care providers outnumber regulated providers in Canada, like doctors and nurses, and they provide the most hands-on care in this population. So there's been some speculation about whether or not this group of care providers, like personal support workers, have adequate clinical knowledge and training to be able to deal appropriately with a situation like the COVID-19 pandemic. I would caution against framing this as that kind of clinical practice issue rather than as a political issue. So the biggest challenges faced by these care providers are not necessarily a lack of clinical knowledge, but rather some systemic issues that create the conditions for rampant transmission of communicable diseases, such as very low care provider to resident ratios and lack of resources like personal protective equipment, as well as other infection prevention and control supports and measures like adequate amounts and access to hand sanitizer. So these are basic but critical aspects of effective infection control measures that have been severely lacking in many long-term care facilities. So as of June 18th, yesterday, 2020, cumulatively, the region of Waterloo has had just over 1,200 positive tests with 115 deaths. And of those 115 deaths, more than 80 from long-term care outbreaks. It's not unique to Waterloo region, unfortunately. Across Canada, there's growing long-term care outbreaks being reported with similar high numbers of deaths in this population. Okay, so just to make sure to put a little bit of an emphasis on this point, that none of this means that there is no risk in younger age groups. A lower risk does not equal no risk. Or that younger age groups don't have to be concerned about becoming infected with the virus. So possibly being an asymptomatic carrier means putting older parents or grandparents, community members at risk, as well as increasing the risk of ongoing transmission that still threatens to overwhelm our healthcare system, as it has in many places. So we need to be careful about not downplaying the risk to everyone, regardless of age, so that people continue to maintain effective infection control measures as indicated by our highest health authorities and experts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next lecturette. Okay, so that covers a lot of territory. We're about halfway through. So this may be a good time to pause. You may want to have a bit of a stretch. If you have any questions, you might want to write them down at this point, so you can get in touch with us, afterwards when we need contact information. We've talked about the origins of this virus in humans, some of the conditions that led to spillover into human hosts, how to interpret some of those overwhelming, all this information that we're getting about the disease, and some Waterloo region specific information. So, of course, we know that this was first detected in humans in Wuhan, in Hubei province. So how did we get to this current global pandemic, and so deeply, so quickly? So I'm going to pass this back to Michael to talk about how geographic concepts can help us understand how this has spread. And then I'll come back and finish up with some infection prevention techniques that are important to understand.
I'm going to talk about a couple of geographical concepts, but it's worth mentioning that Jennifer just gave us a beautiful demonstration how the craft that is always considered the geographer's domain, namely map making, can be used to suggest certain ways that data should be interpreted, simply by moving the category borders for how you take the data and split it into classes. That already can make a huge difference. And so geographers also look at how these issues are being communicated with the help of maps, for example. And what we find is that in the last 5 years, because of the availability of mapping software, more maps have been produced than in the entire human history up to 5 years ago. So there are lots more maps out there than ever before, and yet we geographers often find that the quality of these maps often is tragically poor. And so it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of map literacy that Jennifer just provided us with. So thanks, Jennifer. That really fits well with what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what does spread mean? How does it proceed? What are the principles behind spread? And when our geographers talk about spread, they use the word diffusion, how something spreads through space and over time. And there are different types of diffusion, and I'm going to introduce a couple of them. The type of diffusion can vary between different things or ideas or money or whatever is diffusing. So let's have a couple of examples here. So I'm using a graph here from a textbook, and we're assuming that we're looking down onto this plane, and the large red dot in the left part of the graph. That represents the biggest city in this entire area, and then the medium-size dots represent larger towns, and then all the small red ones represent villages. So we have settlements of different sizes. So how can we envision a spread? Well, in various ways. The first and simple one is expansion diffusion, where something expands outward and spreads that way. Now that is often called contagious diffusion because it usually applies to diseases, because diseases require contact. And contact happens between direct neighbors usually. So you have this progression of an infection from the center, in this case the large city, to the neighbors, and from there to their neighbors. So we could be talking about a disease here, for example. Then we have another way in which a diffusion process can happen. That's called hierarchical diffusion. And here the infection skips over space, if you will, to a more distant place and then spreads from there. So in this case, we see that let's call it an infection for argument's sake here, is spreading from the largest settlement, the city, directly to the second category, the towns, and from the towns then to the villages. So from there on, it's almost a contagious or expansion diffusion. And the way, this particular way of diffusion is often seen when we have ideas, innovations, or fashions spreading. Why? Well, think of it, if a new fashion is established, let's say a very quirky shoe fashion, you won't have the new type of shoe available in every small little settlement. You usually start out with a big city where you have specialized stores that offer these crazy new shoes, and then they become available in the next smaller category and so on. But also, often there is a transport connection, right? For hierarchical diffusion to happen, often that is facilitated by airline connections, for example. Or you have lifestyles that are concentrated in larger settlements and are very rare in small settlements. So there could be all kinds of social, transportation, infrastructure reasons for that type of hierarchical diffusion. And there are other diffusion types out there as well. So what I want to simply drill down to is that in real life, we often find mixed diffusion, right? We have both processes, hierarchical and expansion diffusion, blended together. And often we find that the path of the infection, the diffusion, follows transportation networks. So here, for example, in this graph, we could use the example of the 1980 Spanish flu, which followed railway corridors in its spread and shipping routes. And you can very nicely see that in our mapping of the disease in our historical map. And as we are talking, we have the same thing happening with all the spring breakers who, against better judgment, went to Florida in spring of 2020. And you could see days after, when they returned from spring break in Florida, how they spread across the entire continental United States. And we could see that through simply tapping into their cell phone data, their cell phone signal, without violating their privacy. We could simply see that the mass of cell phones of these spring breakers that was in Daytona Beach in that week, next week was all over the United States. And of course, not just their cell phones traveled back to their hometowns with them, but presumably COVID-19 as well, right? Going back very quickly to the previous slide, here in the HIV spread that is represented here in hierarchical diffusion, we have the historical example of HIV, which spread first through airline connections to major European and American cities, then spread through the lifestyle choices of the most at-risk populations, and then worked its way down, if you will, into smaller settlements. So very applicable historical examples of how we find these diffusion patterns. Now, it doesn't matter what pattern it is, several factors are out there that speed up diffusion, that can make it faster. So the first one is proximity. The closer susceptible people are together, for example, in long-term care homes, as Jennifer mentioned, or in bars where young, healthy people are very close to each other and talking very loudly, spreading lots of aerosols. that proximity can greatly speed up diffusion. It can lead to those hotspots that we hear about all the time. Connectivity of a location can play a big role. Let's take the two town cities of Brampton and Bramalea, right next to each other on the west side of Toronto. But Bramalea is fairly isolated in terms of traffic connections, whereas Brampton has a train station, has a subway station, has all kinds of bus interconnection. Bramalea is not connected that much. So the spread is not as much fostered by the relative isolation of Bramalea. Next is a more general point. Geographers call this time-space convergence. And what it simply means is that as our technological capabilities are growing, we find that distances are shrinking. We don't think anything anymore about jumping on a plane and flying to Europe for a meeting, before COVID, that is, right? Years ago, you would have had to spend a lot of time on an ocean liner. In the 50s. It would have taken a week to get to the other continent. 100 years ago with the sailing ship, it would have taken possibly 3 months if the winds weren't favorable. But with increasing capabilities, time and space have shrunk. That's simply what that means. So we can travel more fast, cheaper, we can go to more distant places and do so more comfortably. And that, again, aids in spreading anything out there. The last point I want to mention here is globalization. And that is important because it has a 1-2 punch impact. Globalization, the borderless flow of people, money, information, influence, ideas, it means that it speeds up the emergence, as we discussed in the first lecture, and the subsequent spread of zoonotic diseases. So the more globalized we make this planet, the more zoonotic diseases we will probably encounter, and the faster they will spread once we as humans have acquired them. So that is a really big factor. On the other hand, we find a few factors that slow down diffusion. One of them can be simply distance. We call that the friction of distance. The farther two things are apart, the less interaction there is usually between them. Of course, I just said time-space convergence is working very hard at diminishing this friction of distance. More specifically, it's not just about physical distance in kilometers or miles, it's also about accessibility, depending not just how far something is away, but also how easy it is to cover that distance to that location. So the Arctic, for example, has only very few ways of getting to it. You can't just drive to the Arctic, you have to fly. So there are very few entrance points, which reduces the accessibility. Same with the Bruce Peninsula. If you want to go to the Bruce Peninsula, there's one way of getting there, Highway 6. Right? We don't have to go very far to find a relative lack of accessibility in our own neighborhood. And then lastly, intervening opportunity. It means, for example, that people who are looking for a cottage, if they live in the Toronto area, will probably choose the Muskoka region because that's the closest opportunity, and they will not go to the Sudbury region to buy a much cheaper property there because it is not as convenient. We call that an intervening opportunity. So the spread of something might stop at the intervening, at the earliest opportunity, and not progress farther than that. So those are some of the effects that geographers are observing when they look at the diffusion of a process, of a fashion, of a disease, and how it is influenced. The question that we're interested in, of course, is how can we contribute to the containment of this pandemic? And it's not rocket science. We have to maximize our distance and minimize our interaction. And you have heard so much about that in the last 3 months that I don't think I have to stress that anymore. We should also reduce our travel so we don't take the infection to places that so far have been spared. So as I say there, it's not rocket science. We just have to do it. We have to stick to it. That's our best and maybe our only chance of containing this pandemic in the absence of a vaccine or a real effective medication. And that is it from my side. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it over again to Jennifer. There you go, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I know that we've heard a lot about the things that we can do to help contain things. And I am going to stress the importance of all of these actions and activities in this next section. So this will wrap up our talk for today on a bit more of a practical note. There's the disease itself. So these are the biological and physiological processes that create the pathogenesis of disease, or the various mechanisms that make us sick. And then there's how we as humans interact with the disease. So our ways of preventing or controlling, our ways of treating or living with the disease. And if we look at geographies of health, these ways of interacting vary widely from place to place with strong cultural, environmental, social, and economic influences. Of course, the main prevention intervention in place in Canada and around the world right now, as Michael mentioned, is social distancing or physical distancing. So our Chief Public Health Officer in Canada, Dr. Theresa Tam, started using the term physical distancing at the end of March to reflect that many people don't need to stop social interactions to maintain physical distance, largely thanks to the internet and things like we're doing here with you today. But there can be a lot of anxiety about how to protect ourselves when we do go out for groceries and other necessities. And this anxiety may be amplified as more things begin to open up, as we're seeing now, and we start to have more exposure to people and places, especially if we're part of those more vulnerable populations. So because there's so much information out there, we can kind of develop this information fatigue, which I think Michael was alluding to, where we just can't take anymore, and we become sort of complacent and we start to relax our precautions prematurely for that reason. The level of risk that we face depends on several factors, including the prevalence of the virus where you are and some of the other factors that we've already discussed. And because we're still learning so much about this virus, and while we wait for things like a vaccine and effective treatments, it's incredibly important to remain vigilant with our infection prevention and control practices. So the main things that I want to cover in our remaining time are hand hygiene, and I'll wrap up a little bit with the use of masks, since we're seeing so much of that around us lately. I also briefly want to mention environmental cleaning in the home. I've had lots of questions about whether or not mail is safe, or takeout food containers, or if we need to wipe down our groceries. So general guidance for cleaning in the home. This was gleaned from the World Health Organization, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and other local health experts, such as infectious diseases specialist Dr. Abdu Sharkawi from the University of Toronto, includes frequent cleaning of high-touch surfaces. So that's phones, handrails, light switches, anything with a handle, doors, cabinets, appliances. And we can clean items simply by wiping them down. So this removes or reduces the amount of virus on surfaces, which lowers our risk of infection. We can also disinfect items. This is using chemicals that kill microorganisms. So if you're using a disinfecting wipe like Lysol or something similar, these can both clean and disinfect. The cleaning part is the wiping, the physical action, and the disinfecting part is that chemical action. But it's really important to be sure to read what the contact time needs to be. So what that means is that with products like this Lysol product here, as an example, I'm not promoting it. These kinds of products, they need a certain amount of time to stay wet on the surface to be effective. Often this requires more than one wipe, which many people aren't aware of. So for example, this product needs to stay wet for 4 minutes to be effective. So if you think about wiping something down, it usually dries off pretty quickly. In this case, you may need multiple wipes to get that effective action. Okay, so when it comes to handling things like food containers, groceries, so wiping down groceries or the outside of items, this can really help to reduce some of the anxiety that we're having. But regardless of whether you wipe your containers or packages down or not, by far, really the very most important thing that you can do, that you need to be conscious of, is good hand hygiene. So food packaging, This has always been potentially a source of contaminants or pathogens. So for example, packaging can harbor fecal matter, viruses, body fluids, even things like cocaine. This is nothing new. So it's always been important, it will continue to be important, to clean our hands after we handle things like food packaging. So unless we receive new information from our top health experts about the virus, the emphasis should still be on clean hands. Okay, so this is the chain of transmission. This is how microorganisms make us sick. So an agent, such as a virus, exits a reservoir through a portal of exit. So this would be secretions from our nose or our mouth, travels. This would be through talking, coughing, or sneezing, and then gains entry to a susceptible host. So with SARS-CoV-2, we're talking about entry through our mucous membrane. So this is our eyes, noses, and mouths. So infection will not happen if any one of these chains is broken. And you'll notice here that hand hygiene is specifically mentioned in 3 of these chains, arguably could go under a 4th of susceptible host. So along with physical distancing, hand hygiene is the most important intervention for us to implement properly because it breaks that chain of transmission. So hand hygiene is part of our routine practices. We're used to washing our hands, before we handle food, before we eat, after using the bathroom, touching a pet. These are part of our normal daily activities already. So while we start to build maybe some better hand hygiene habits, we should try to build in the proper way to do it so that it becomes an easy part of our routine practices and we don't have to think about it all the time, which I think we're all getting a little bit tired of hearing about clean hands. So I've heard some people say, oh, it's fine, I just won't touch my face. So that's a little bit like saying, oh, it's fine, I just won't blink. So touching our faces is so unconscious. It's estimated that we touch our faces more than 20 times an hour, hundreds of times a day. And of course, you don't even realize that you're doing it. So the best way to protect yourself from this kind of spread is good hand hygiene. And I just want to mention here that wearing gloves is not the best way to protect yourselves because gloves don't stop you from touching your face and may actually provide a false sense of security. Wearing gloves does not replace the need for hand hygiene at all. And it's worth mentioning that you should never use hand sanitizer on gloves. I see people doing this all the time. This is not an effective hand hygiene technique. So a proper hand wash with soap and water, this is still the best way to wash your hands, but of course it's not always possible. And so hand sanitizer is an excellent alternative and sometimes the best choice depending on the situation. So it's important to remember that part of good hand hygiene is skincare. I hear a lot of people right now talking about how hand sanitizer hurts their hands when they put it on. It stings, it burns. So our skin is a barrier. We need it to stay intact to provide that barrier as a first line of defense. So this includes things like staying hydrated, using warm water when we wash our hands, not hot water. Hot water is actually very dehydrating. And then patting our hands dry instead of rubbing. So especially if you're using those rough brown paper towels, they can really compromise the integrity of your skin. And then of course, moisturizing. So because of the amount of hand hygiene that we're all doing right now, it's really important to keep that skin moisturized to really help keep it intact. And so that most of all, so it doesn't hurt when we use hand sanitizer. So cleaning our hands, many of you may be thinking that this seems really obvious. One of the things that I learned working for years in infection control and being a hand hygiene educator is that even trained healthcare professionals don't always get this right. And developing good hand hygiene practice takes a conscious effort. So in the additional resources that have been provided, we've included some videos and some infographics about how to properly clean your hands. Also very happy to answer any questions that you have about this with our contact information that will be provided at the end. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the use of masks. So many of us have started wearing masks when we leave the house. So whether it's a medical mask, also called a procedure mask or a surgical mask, like you see here on the left, or a homemade or non-medical mask, like the one on the right. The current recommendation from our Chief Public Health Officer is for everyone to wear a non-medical mask when physical distancing isn't possible. And so we felt that it was important to just sort of touch on this issues. When recommendations are made without clear instructions, that action can actually become a bit of a safety issue. It can become a bit of a risk factor. So the use of a mask is part of what we would call additional precautions outside of what we would routinely do. And they're unique. This particular precaution of mask wearing, it's unique because the emphasis on the mask is not to protect ourselves, but it's actually to protect others in the event that you're an asymptomatic or a pre-symptomatic carrier of this virus. And what we're doing with the mask is we're breaking that chain of transmission at the portal of exit and the traveling stages, because this virus is carried in droplets. And so we're blocking those droplets with a mask. So my mask protects you from my droplets, and then your mask protects me. So even with a mask, especially non-medical masks, we still need to practice proper cough etiquette. And with our masks on, we should still be coughing into our sleeve, into our shoulder, into our elbow. So with that said, the importance of using masks, to use a mask improperly, as I said, could put you at a greater risk of self-contaminating, because it's covering and it's in proximity to those entry points in that chain of transmission, our eyes, nose, and mouth. So studies have shown that even with trained healthcare workers, a significant number of contaminations are happening during the removal process of personal protective equipment. Again, in the resources lists, I've provided a short video to show you how to properly use a mask when physical distancing is difficult. And I'm going to provide a bit of an overview right now. Nothing too dramatic. So first of all, before you go anywhere near your face to put on a mask or otherwise, you need to clean your hands. So either with a 20-second soap and water wash or with hand sanitizer until the sanitizer is dry. So when handling your mask, as much as possible, you want to try to only handle the ear loops. So you can put it on, and you can do one readjustment when you first put it on. Once your mask is in place, you've adjusted it, you want to finish by cleaning your hands. To remove your mask, again, make sure your hands are clean before you go anywhere near your face. And then you're going to remove your mask by the ear loops or the elastic. So the front of your mask, this part, is the dirtiest. So you want to avoid touching this part of your mask. You can put your non-medical masks in a clean bag for washing, or you can throw out disposable masks. Once you've removed that mask, you've now handled a dirty mask. So clean your hands right away before you touch anything else. You want to change your masks when they get damp or dirty, remembering to always have clean hands before you handle a mask around your face where those portals of entry are. And for those of you who have been wearing homemade masks, you know that it doesn't take very long for that mask to become a bit damp. So if you're using reusable or washable masks, be sure to have multiples that you can change out. Okay, so two big mistakes. We've all seen them. You should not wear your mask below your nose. And of course, the next one, you should also not be wearing your mask below your chin. So both of these will put you and others at risk. Not only because that portal of exit is now wide open, putting at others at risk, which is the whole purpose of wearing that mask in the first place, but because masks are considered dirty. So your hands will also become contaminated with everything that you're touching. So you're increasing your risk of self-inoculation because when you wear a mask incorrectly, you're repeatedly touching your face to adjust it, probably with dirty hands. So if you're going to wear a mask, wear it properly so that it does what it's supposed to be doing, which is protecting others, but also wear it properly to reduce your risk of self-contaminating with dirty hands that have picked up those pathogens from objects around us. Okay. So I don't know if that was more of a review than people were looking for, but I'm really hoping that it's been interesting, that there's been some piece of it that's been helpful, some piece that you can take away and that you've enjoyed it. So it has been my absolute pleasure to give this presentation with Michael today. So thank you very much. And now I will pass it back over to Michael.
Thank you. I also want to thank you, Jennifer, for doing this presentation with me. And I want to thank all of you who have listened to us for your interest. And I hope that you will send us questions that you may have so we can answer those, point you to other resources, or if you want to let us know about something that you have found out that you might find could help us. So thank you very much from both of us to the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning to give us this opportunity. And I hope that we will meet again, and we actually will meet again in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael and Jennifer, for your lecture. Michael and Jennifer have provided some additional materials you may wish to review following this lecture to further your learning. These materials have been provided on the course webpage. We know that learning has and always will be a social activity, so we encourage you to share this lecture with friends and families to discuss what you have learned today. If you'd like to learn more about the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning, please visit wlu.ca/LALL.